What's up, guys? Hope you're having a good day. I want to kick this video off by saying sorry for the losing bets on Strickland and Silva on the last card. It's a bit annoying to kick off a new year with a loss. We had a pretty good 2023 and I'm confident 2024 is going to be great as well. You know, we've been doing pretty good on pre-fight bets, but it sucked to lose those two bets on the last card. Bit annoying, you know what I mean? Betting on any sport's difficult. You can't win them all. But it was definitely disappointing, the nature of those two losses. I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is a late upload, which I'm sorry for. I've been crazy busy this week. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, waste your time. Just quickly go through both fights, just recap really quickly. I think Mayra Silva's performance was dreadful. Obviously, when we researched that fight as a community, we saw that she had quite a big edge when it came to striking, and in all of her past fights, she'd used grappling heavy game plans. She'd have the odd submission win here and there, but that was in situations where her opponent had initiated the grappling and taken her down. For whatever reason, she decided to come into her fight against Pennington and for the first time ever use a grappling heavy game plan, which was a really bad strategy because Pennington's very difficult to take down and hold down. We knew that Silva's path to victory was winning the fight on the feet. She was the superior striker, yet she chose to try and out-grapple a better MMA grappler, and that's what got her into trouble because she tired herself out. Obviously, we know Pennington, cardio machine, and just outworked her and out-hustled her. Something strange did happen in the second round where Pennington landed a combination, and then after the combination landed, Silva kind of fell apart. Someone in my community said that Silva posted after the fact that she burst her eardrum early in the fight, which basically threw her off her game and led to her performing the way she did. I don't know. I haven't looked into that myself. I don't know if that's true. Let me know in the comments below. But that would certainly go some way towards explaining why Silva looked so bad in rounds 3, 4, and 5, when in the past she's looked so good and has never really slowed down. So that was one of those losses where a fighter just came in with a strategy and game plan that was different to what you'd expect them to use based on their past performances. And losses like that are really frustrating because they're quite difficult to predict. Because if you obviously go back and watch a fighter's past fights and they always fight in the same way, you'd assume they're going to continue to fight in that same way. You know, in the fight that you're betting on them in, but sometimes they don't. And that was the situation with Mayra Silva. When it came to the Dricus du Plessis-Sean Strickland fight, another frustrating loss. A big talking point around that fight and the justification for the bet was that obviously we looked at all of du Plessis' past fights and his cardio looked really, really bad, and we were in that situation where we knew if he showed up and slowed down against Strickland like he did against Tavares, Till and Brunson, he was going to get dominated. But we also knew that we couldn't be totally sure that he would slow against Strickland like he did in those fights because he'd had nose surgery, which he said has corrected some damage to his nose that has been plaguing him for a long time. That restricted his ability to breathe through his nose. And we saw that his cardio looked incredible against Strickland. In actual fact, what was quite amazing was that in the second half of the fight, rounds 3, 4, and 5, du Plessis actually looked fresher than Strickland, which I never again would have been able to have predicted. Never would have anticipated that. Strickland's a cardio machine, and yet du Plessis was really putting it on him in the second half of the fight. Now, having said that, I don't think it was a particularly good decision. I did think Strickland won the fight quite clear, and before you jump in the comments and call me a biased idiot, that's completely wrong and du Plessis won. Just hear me out for a second. Generally speaking, when it comes to scoring fights that I've bet on, I'm very pessimistic in terms of I will give probably more credit to the fighter that I'm betting against than I should. I am not in any way biased. I'm quite pessimistic towards scoring. Therefore, the fact that I scored the fight for Strickland when I am pessimistic scoring fights towards guys I've bet on is usually a sign it was a pretty bad decision. Now, I'll explain in a moment why I think it was a bad decision. But before I do that, I also just want to talk a little bit about how annoyed and angry I am with MMA judging at the moment. And this has got absolutely nothing to do with the Strickland Duplessis fight, or absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I bet the fight. For me, I'm just coming to a point in my career where I'm watching fighters have their careers derailed every single weekend because judges can't be bothered to do their job properly. And even though all of us see this happen every single weekend, nothing gets done about it. Every week we see the same judges turn up to rob more and more fighters, to derail more and more fighters. And when Dana gets asked about it, he's like, sorry bro, not my problem. I'm going to go play blackjack with the Nelk boys. You'll have to talk to the commission about that. I can't do anything about it. Now this is absolute bullshit. Absolute bullshit and a total cop-out from Dana. Because Dana can do quite a lot about the state of judging at the moment. It is fucking awful. It's getting worse. It's never been worse. And every single weekend, we see horrendous decisions. Now, I'm not saying the Strickland Duplessis fight was a horrendous decision. I'm just using this fight as an opportunity to talk about the judging in general. Insert any other fight which was a terrible decision, and everything that I'm saying would apply. Like the Tavares versus Siddy fight as an example, where every single person in the fucking world scored that fight for Siddy, apart from the 3 fucking knuckleheads sat cage side whose actual job it is to score the fight correctly. So don't think I'm being biased, forget about all that. The point I'm trying to make is Dana has a lot of power to improve judging in the sport, you know, and he just isn't. He just doesn't care. And people that will jump to his defense and be like, oh, well, the athletic commissions employ the judges, Dana has no control over it, blah, 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 blah. That's not really true, because athletic commissions get paid by promoters doing events in their jurisdictions. So Dana actually has a lot more power and a lot more influence over judging than he would have you believe. Because if the UFC don't hold events in certain jurisdictions, the athletic commission that governs events in that jurisdiction lose income, because, you know, they're not having UFC events in their territory that they're earning money from, right? So if Dana made a big deal about how bad judging is and demanded that it improved, and used the influence of the UFC to put pressure on athletic commissions, I think we would see massive improvements to judging. I think if Dana went out and said or implemented an initiative, something along the lines of 3 strikes and you're out. If we have one extremely bad decision on a card in your territory, then it's a warning, and you've got to, you know, come out and explain why you scored that fight in that way. If it's indefensible, you've got to, you know, explain to us what you've done to rectify the situation, make sure it won't happen again. Have you been retrained? You know, what have you studied? The scoring criteria again, all that kind of stuff, right? It's like first strike, warning. Second strike, the UFC, you know, as soon as within a 12-month period you get another really bad decision in a territory, you do not hold another event in that territory for 6 months. And then once you go back, 3 strikes happens again, you don't go back to that territory for a year. At the end of the day, over the last 20 years, while I've been watching the UFC, I've lost count of how many times I've heard Dana say fighters are at the fighter safety, fighter health, fighter well-being is at the forefront of the UFC's priorities, and that's all that matters, and he cares about the fighters, he cares about the athletes, blah, 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 blah. Well, actually, start fucking taking some actions to show it, because the amount of fighters that lose their win bonuses, or the amount of fighters that have their careers derailed due to bad judging, is actually disgraceful, and something needs to be done about it. And it's been going on for too long, too many years, and Dana is a disgrace for continually burying his head in the sand. It's a fucking joke, and it pisses me off, because not only does it, cost fighters win bonuses, and let's be real, they don't get paid very much anyway. You know what I mean? If you're on, $20,000 show, $20,000 win contract, and judges rob you, you only make 20 grand for that year if you blow your ACL out and can't fight for 18 months. Do you know what I mean? It's a big difference between earning 20 grand and 40 grand. It's a disgrace. And on top of that, what's really bad is when you see fighters who are on a losing streak get robbed by the judges, and then the promotion ruthlessly releases them from their contract shortly after. It's a disgrace. He's a real bad taste in my mouth. I don't like it. And Dana needs to do better, a lot better. I'm going to keep talking about this because it's fucking triggering. So yeah, talking about the Du Plessis-Strickland fight, going back to that, I do think it was a bad decision. But this is coming from a place of someone that I really care about the sport, okay? So when it comes to judging, I demand absolute excellency. So when I say it's a bad decision, I'm not saying that it wasn't a close fight. I'm not saying that Du Plessis didn't do great. I'm not saying Du Plessis didn't look great. What I'm saying is, if you watch that fight and score it in line with the actual scoring criteria, Du Plessis lost, despite the fact it was a very close competitive fight. And I really, really hate it when people try to justify incorrect decisions on the basis that a fight was close. It really, really bothers me because you guys know I bet a lot on football, and the standard of officiating in football is absolutely superb. Like, the amount of times bad refereeing influences a fight and costs me money, or the amount of times the judges get a decision wrong and it costs me money, and it never balances out. People that say, oh, it'll balance out over the long term, it won't balance out over the long term, because if you're getting your money into a strong position a much higher than you're getting your money into a weaker position, you've never got your money in weak positions a high enough volume of the time for things to balance out. So it doesn't balance out. That's a fallacy. It doesn't balance out. It never will, and it never has. And I lose exponentially more due to bad judging and bad refereeing than I gain. Exponentially more. It's not even close. It's been like that for 15 years. But getting back on track, officiating in football is brilliant, right? I honestly can't remember the last time officials cost me a loss in football. And I place 30, 40 bets on football a month. They never cost me money. It's been months since an official cost me a loss in football. So I demand excellence. I want a similar level of officiating, a similar level of refereeing, a similar level of judging to other sports, where you're always going to get mistakes. Human error can't be avoided, but 99% of the time, they're going to get it right. And judges should be getting it right 99% of the time. So why did the judges get the decision between Strickland and Du Plessis wrong? Well, if we think about the three scoring criterias in MMA, it's a tiered system. Okay, so the first scoring criteria in MMA is effective striking and grappling. That is the only thing that you should focus on, and that's the only thing you should score a fight on. If striking and grappling is equal, you then go to the second tier, which is aggression. And then if you cannot separate who won the fight based on effective striking, then then who's the more aggressive, who's the aggressor, who's pushing the action, who's going for the win. Then you go to the third tier of scoring criteria, which is octagon control. But it explicitly states in the scoring criteria that you should hardly ever be in a position where you have to even consider aggression, because the primary scoring criteria is effective striking and grappling. You should be able to score a fight based on that, and you shouldn't need to go to the second and third tiers, which are aggression and octagon control. These should only be considerations in very, very rare circumstances. So the reason why the decision was very bad in line with the scoring criteria is Sean Strickland outstruck Du Plessis in the majority of those rounds. And it might not be that clear if you're watching on a low quality stream, but if you're watching on a nice high resolution display, you'll see that even though Du Plessis was the aggressor, he was the guy coming forward, most of the stuff that he threw, or most of the punches that he threw across the 5 rounds were caught on the hands, the arms, the gloves, the shoulder. Sean was deflecting it. A big percentage of Duplessis' shots. Obviously, Duplessis landed some stuff for sure, but Strickland blocked a lot of it. And definitely outstruck Duplessis in 3 of the 5 rounds, which were enough for him to take a decision. And I think the judges fucked it up because Duplessis was the aggressor. And that shouldn't have mattered because it's a second scoring criteria behind effective striking and grappling. And since Strickland outstruck Duplessis, he was the more effective striker. Therefore, aggression shouldn't have come into it. On top of that, effective grappling shouldn't have had an influence on the outcome of the fight because every time Duplessis took Strickland down, he struggled to obtain a dominant position. Strickland immediately popped back up to his feet. So Strickland won the fight. If you go by the scoring criteria, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a close fight. People always go crazy when I say a close fight was a bad decision. And I think this is one of the reasons why Dana gets away with not addressing and improving how bad judging is in the UFC. Because whenever we get a close fight, a fight that is remotely competitive, and the judges get the decision wrong, there's a good percentage of the MMA community that immediately rushes out and goes, no, it wasn't a robbery, wasn't a bad decision, it was a close fight, could go either way. And they just do that, and they just fucking bam, 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 and nothing gets done. Next event, there's another close competitive fight. The judges score it incorrectly, and nothing gets done because it was a close fight. It's a close fight. If it's a close fight, we can write any numbers down on the scorecard. Who cares? And this is the problem I have with MMA judging, in that no one is out there demanding excellency. No one is looking at football and being like, right, we've got VAR video review, 4 officials watching the game like a hawk, 60 different cameras, everything captured, everything seen, and 95% of the time the correct decision is being made every time, and it's a very fair, honest and pure sport. We don't have that in the UFC, and it's never going to change if people keep making excuses for bad decisions. So I think it's perfectly okay for us to say Strickland Duplessis was a bad decision. It's also perfectly okay for us to acknowledge it was a very close competitive fight and Duplessis looked incredible. It wasn't a correct decision based on the scoring criteria. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I know I'm probably going to get torn apart in the comments, but I'm sick of kind of bottling this all up and keeping quiet just because I don't want people to tear me apart in the comments and call me biased and all this shit. Got to the point where I just don't care, and I just want to see judges do their job, and I just want to see the sport become more fair for fighters, because I'm sick of seeing people get win bonuses stolen, careers derailed, and obviously, like we said earlier, the very worst of worst situations where fighters, lose a decision they probably should have won, and they get released from the UFC, which is absolutely ruthless. I don't know how Dana sleeps at night. So I don't even know I've been ranting for this long about that. I didn't want to, but I'm so passionate about judging and how it needs to improve that I just go off on tangents. So I apologise. Let's get into this one now. Let me know what you think, but be gentle. Let's get into this one. Nasruddin Imavov against Roman Dolidze. Sorry, apologies. Okay, so let's get into it. So Nasruddin Imavov is the favourite at average odds of around 1.60, which is going to be minus 167 for an implied probability of 63%. If we take a look at the odds on Roman Dolidze, he's around an average of, say, 2.35, which is going to be plus 135 for an implied probability of 43%. So roughly 60-40 in the eyes of the bookies, give or take a few percentage points. Imavov, 27 years old, 6'3", with a 75-inch reach. Dolidze, 35 years old, 6'2", with a 76-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same size. There is quite a big age gap. There's an age gap of 8 years, which statistically gives the younger fighter around about close to a 70% chance of winning 7-0. However, I don't think age is going to have a particularly big influence on this matchup. Remember, stats are only useful when interpreted correctly, simply because Dolidze is not particularly old for a middleweight. 35 years old, kind of a prime for a middleweight. And also on top of that, Dolidze is a fighter who is improving. So when we talk about age gaps and younger fighters having statistical advantages, that's usually on the basis that the younger guy will be, improving from fight to fight, and the older guy will be declining. But that's not really the case here. So I would ignore that stat if I were you. So it's a very interesting match from a stylistic point of view. And you guys know I've been very critical of Roman Dolidze over the years, just like I was very critical of Dricus du Plessis on the last card. Fighters like Dolidze and du Plessis, when they rely a lot on their tankiness, a lot on their power, a lot on their physicality, they often run into trouble as they face a step up in competition and go up against a more technical, a more technically superior level of opponent. And I'm interested to see if that happens to Dolidze in this matchup, because if we look at the guys that he's been facing, Imavov certainly is quite a big step up, in my opinion. Staropoli, Dorcas, Phil Hawes, relatively low-level guys. Marvin Vettori, quite slow, quite flat-footed, doesn't really have any power in his hands. He's not that athletic, he's not that technical. Hermansson's obviously very good, but to be fair, Roman Dolidze struggled extremely bad in this fight and then snatched a Hail Mary submission out of nowhere. We're going to show a little bit of footage of that fight, because I do think it's quite relevant to how this matchup could play out. But it's a big step up against Imavov, and I'm interested to see if Dolidze's power, physicality and tankiness can kind of close the skill gap in the same way we saw du Plessis use his power and tankiness to close the skill gap last week against Strickland. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, I would expect a decent portion of this fight to take place on the feet, or at least the majority of this fight to take place on the feet. So if we cover how they match up when it comes to grappling first, I know a lot of people will disagree with me on this, because Dolidze has a few kind of flashy submissions. So there's a perception of Dolidze that he's very good on the ground. And I know this will trigger people, what I'm about to say, but for me, Dolidze's ground game is more similar to someone like Polyana Viana than a particularly good MMA grappler. In the sense that, to be fair, Dolidze's MMA grappling is pretty bad. His offensive wrestling's not great. His ground game's not great. He also slows down quite quickly when he grapples. And if anyone disagrees or disputes with my assessment of Dolidze's grappling, please go and watch his fight against Trevin Giles, where you will see exactly what I'm talking about. He looked absolutely dreadful on the ground. And so I'm one of these guys that all I'm doing in these breakdowns is just reiterating to you guys what I've seen in the footage. Based on the footage, Dolidze's ground game is awful. Has he snatched the odd long shot submission here and there? For sure. But from a technical point of view, his ground game is not very good. Now, because he's so strong and physically imposing, if he gets on top of you, his top game's heavy, his ground and pound is nasty. He's also an opportunistic submission grappler, that has a sneaky submission game. But again, for me, Dolidze's ground game is closer to a Paul Craig or closer to a Polyana Viana that might snatch the odd highlight reel submission here and there. But they're MMA grappling. I mean, he's not going to go out there and do to you what a Tazrukian or a Makhachev or, a properly good MMA grappler could do. Someone like a Gamrot as an example. Imavov is an interesting fighter when it comes to grappling, because Imavov is one of these grapplers who is a little bit of a unicorn. He's a little bit unique in the sense that he's very good offensively and absolutely terrible defensively. So usually what we usually see with grapplers, what is logical for us to see with grapplers, is that if a fighter is a good offensive grappler, they will be a good defensive grappler as well. Because obviously, in order to develop a decent offensive grappling game, you've got to train very hard and spend a lot of time grappling. Therefore, naturally, in the process, you'll also develop a semi-decent defensive grappling game. But Imavov fits into the category of quite rare fighters who's very good at one aspect and very bad at the other. So Imavov offensively is a pretty good grappler. Relatively decent takedowns because he's got that long frame which he can use to like wrap his arms around your body and legs and drag you to the ground. Pretty heavy from top position, pretty good grappling control. On the flip side, his takedown offense isn't bad, to be fair, but if you put this guy on his back, he's very, very weak off his back, doesn't really know how to defend himself, and very low level. So out of the two, they're both very flawed on the ground. And it's quite difficult to call because both these guys are very dangerous when the aggressor. So if Dolidze gets on top of Imavov, because of how bad Imavov is on the bottom, Imavov's going to be in a lot of trouble. If Imavov gets on top of Dolidze, because of how bad Dolidze's ground game is, he's going to be in a lot of trouble. So in terms of who has the edge on the ground, it is a tricky one. A very tricky one. What I would also say is both these guys gas out pretty fucking quick if you make them grapple. So if we do see grappling early in this fight, this matchup could see a huge change to its dynamic and become real sloppy real fast. But both these guys are very aware of how much they slow down in grappling positions, which is why for the most part they both choose to stand and bang as much as possible. And so for that reason, I do feel, you know, the majority of this fight is likely to take place on the feet. And if it takes place on the feet, it's a pretty interesting matchup because Dolidze is making very big improvements from fight to fight. And while this is a very big step up in competition for him, similar to Duplessis last week, he's just got that grit, that determination, that will to win, and you can never count a guy like Dolidze out. Having said that, Imavov's pretty tough and determined as well. So what I'm going to do is show you a bit of footage of Dolidze as I'm kind of explaining to you how these two match up from a technical point of view, because I'm hoping that will help you understand why this could potentially be a very, very difficult stylistic matchup for Dolidze, but why he is capable of winning. So we're going to go to his fight against Jack Hermansson to show you the issues that Dolidze is likely to run into in this fight and why this is a difficult stylistic matchup for him. So what we first of all need to do is set the scene, and as I'm breaking these two down, just watch footage of Dolidze. So I'm going to explain to you why you're seeing here, and then why Imavov's quite a difficult stylistic matchup for Dolidze. So what you'll see in this fight is Hermansson light on his feet, bouncing around on the outside, using a counter-striking game plan against Dolidze. And what he's doing is using his length and his footwork and his movement to just chip away at Dolidze from a safe distance. And because Dolidze is not particularly technical, not particularly fast, not particularly good at cutting the cage off, doesn't have particularly good footwork, what you see is Dolidze looking a little bit lost in there, where Hermansson's chipping away at him and he can't really get near Hermansson because he doesn't know how to deal with Hermansson's footwork. So just watch out for that, because it will take you a few minutes to see it. It's not like I can show you a 10 to 20 second clip. But basically what you'll see in this fight is Dolidze looks a little bit lost. He's got a guy in Hermansson that's bouncing around, throwing a really diverse range of strikes. And because Dolidze is quite a low-level basic striker, he's just struggling to read Hermansson, and he's struggling to get anything off. So that makes this a particularly difficult stylistic matchup for Dolidze, because we know Imavov is also quite a technical striker that does a pretty good job of using his length and his reach. We know Imavov likes to, stay on the outside, fight at a safe distance, and just use his length and his range to chip away at you and rack up volume. And while Imavov is definitely more willing to engage on the feet with Hermansson, in this fight you could see that Hermansson didn't want to exchange with Dolidze. He respected his power and just kind of danced around him a lot. Imavov is definitely going to be more willing to engage with Dolidze. He has more confidence in his chin, his power, his ability to beat his opponents to the punch and land counters. But at the same time, Imavov is a technician on the feet, and I do think Dolidze is likely going to be in a lot of trouble and will likely get lit up pretty bad early on. So we'll get back to the strikings. We've already covered the grappling. So yeah, I'm hoping you can kind of just see from this footage what I'm talking about, where Dolidze looks a little lost on the feet, can't really get anything going, and is just getting picked apart. I can see Imavov doing the same thing. Now, where this fight gets interesting is similar to how the second half of Duplessis and Strickland got interesting, in that Dolidze has that tankiness about him. So because he's very strong and powerful and physically imposing, he's able to walk through a lot of the stuff that volume strikers will throw at him, and he's able to walk guys down and just put them under a lot of pressure. We saw that in the Marvin Vettori fight. Imavov is a guy that slows down a lot as fights wear on. We saw it in the Strickland matchup. We saw it in the Jacqueline Buckley fight as well. And even though Dolidze also slows down a lot as fights wear on, what you generally get when you have two fighters who have slowed a lot is often the guy who's like stronger, more powerful, more physically imposing can start to swing momentum in their favour. Because when you have, you know, two guys that are very tired, the more physically imposing dude is still going to hit harder and land the more impactful shots. And we saw this to some extent in the Strickland-Duplessis fight, where in the 4th or 5th round, when both guys were getting tired, it was just way easier for Duplessis to walk Strickland down and land his shots. And I could see a similar sort of dynamic in this matchup, where Imavov will likely do really well in the first half of the fight, because he's going to be able to dance around Dolidze and take advantage of the fact that Dolidze is a little bit stuck in the mud and slow and not very technical, as you're seeing here. But if Imavov starts to slow in the 3rd round, which he usually does, go back, watch his Buckley fight, watch his Strickland fight, then you could start to see Dolidze having a lot of success with a similar sort of game plan that he used against Vettori, where he kind of just threw caution in the wind, pressured Vettori, put it on him, got in his face, roughed him up. But before Dolidze can do that, Imavov's going to have to wear down a little bit, because when Imavov is fresh, he is going to light Dolidze up. And so the question is, will Imavov slow down enough for Dolidze to basically swing momentum in his favour, you know, and win enough rounds, you know, on the judges' scorecards? It's a tricky one. I definitely lean Imavov, on the basis that I don't think Dolidze is going to find it easy to take him down. As you can see from the footage, Imavov is likely to outstrike Dolidze very bad early in the fight. And to be fair, both guys do slow, so we can't be absolutely sure Dolidze will do better in the second half of the matchup when both guys are tired. I just have a feeling he will. Particularly because he's very determined and has no quit in him. Now, Imavov's determined, has no quit in him either, but he doesn't have the tankiness, the raw power, the raw physicality of Dolidze. So it's a very interesting fight. Strong lean Imavov. But I'm not going to bet Imavov, because he's a reasonably big favourite, and I don't like betting on guys in 5-rounders that have a tendency to slow around about the 3rd round, because they can sometimes find themselves in big trouble in rounds 4 and 5. So if we now take a look at the over-under on this one, both these guys are pretty tough. Not easy to get either of them out of there. So I do think there's a pretty good chance this one goes the distance. If we look at Imavov's record, he is a bit of a decisionator. You know, frequently goes to a decision, coupled with the fact that Dolidze is very tough and got a bit of a perfect storm for this one to go deep. I know Dolidze has a few finishes recently, but they were against a lower level of opponent than Imavov, and prior to that, you can see that he did fight to plenty of decisions. So I do think there's a pretty good chance this one goes to a decision, or not to a decision, but goes deeper into the fight, just because both are tough, both are durable, both are very determined, both have no quit in them. To be fair, I don't think either of them are that dangerous on the feet either. I know Dolidze does have some knockout wins, but you can see in the Hermanson fight, he is very stiff and slow, so it's not going to be easy for him to catch a really technical striker that fights long like Imavov with a big enough shot to knock him out. And on top of that, Imavov's more of a volume striker, so not that likely he'll land a kill shot on Dolidze either. So I think reasonably good chance this fight goes deep. You know, if you do want to bet the over-under on this matchup, I'm not going to because the odds are a bit steep for me, but I would lean more towards over 2.5 rounds if you did want to bet the over-under on this fight. In terms of the props, I will not be betting a prop on this matchup, but I think the most likely prop to hit is Imavov by decision, which again, I know 25 minutes is a long time. I don't feel super confident in that, but if you really want to bet a prop to make watching the fight more interesting, that's probably the most likely one to hit. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now, let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Renato Money Moicano versus Drew Dober. So, let's start off by taking a look at the odds on this one. So we can see the Moicano is the favourite at average odds of around 1.53, which is going to be minus 189 for an implied probability of 65%. If we take a look at the odds on Drew Dober, he's around an average of 2.50, which is going to be plus 150 for an implied probability of 40%. So again, close to being in the 60-40 range in the eyes of the bookies. And what's very interesting about this matchup is we've also seen a lot of odds movement on this fight, where the odds have significantly improved on Dober, significantly declined on Moicano. Now, to be honest with you, everyone has their own style of gambling, so I don't want to criticize any type of bet or question anything that anyone does when it comes to betting on sports, because if it works for them, it works for them. But personally, this is the kind of fight where if you like money, I would strongly recommend avoiding this fight, simply because my approach to betting on sports is I want to find situations where I can overwhelmingly stack the odds in my favour. And the reason why I do that is because betting on sports is really difficult. Even when you consistently bet on the most likely outcome, it can still be difficult to earn a long-term profit if you're putting your money in lots of situations where there are a lot of risk factors with your bet. My general approach to sports betting is to put my money in situations where my bet has many more ways to win than lose. And the problem with a fight like this is that both guys have extreme advantages in the area that the other is weak. So no matter who you bet on in this fight, you're putting your money in a lot of danger and taking on a lot of risk, because both guys absolutely have the skills required to cause the other giant problems. Let's dig into that a bit. So, we know that Drew Dober's takedown defense is very bad. His ground game is very bad. Let's just fucking put a fucking stamp on that straight away and show you some footage so that you can see for yourself the issue with Dober's takedown defense and ground game. So this is going to be his fight against Mr. Rafael Alves. Now, there's not too much grappling in this fight, but there's a little bit that you can see. Again, we won't spend too long on this, but just so you can see it. So Dober's takedown defense, ground game, very bad. He's very weak off his back. And Drew Dober's also another one of these guys that, because he's been in the UFC forever and he's 35 years old, I look at a guy like Dober and I say, you know, if he hasn't improved his takedown defense and ground game up until this point in his career, he's probably never going to. Because if he was going to make big improvements with his takedown defense and ground game, it would have come earlier. We haven't even talked about the tail of the tape. Obviously, this fight is at lightweight. Just make a little distinction because we have seen Moicano fight in different weight classes. But both guys are roughly the same age, roughly the same size. Moicano's a little bit longer and taller, but they've got a pretty similar reach, so I don't expect size to come into this one. Let's take a look at the grappling. So here you can see Alves gets a takedown from attacking with a guillotine. And all I really want you to focus on in this position is that there's 3.5 minutes left to go in this round. And I just want you to just pay attention to how weak Dober is off his back. And I'm going to skip through, just look how weak he is off his back. Really struggles to create any space for himself to get back up to his feet. He's been on the ground for about a minute now, just in close guard, not really making any attempt to get back up to his feet. Even here where Alves gives him a lot of space to scramble over to the cage or scramble back up to his feet, he just kind of lies on his back for a while before eventually making his move, when you want to see more urgency than that. But this is a notable position because Dober spent 2 minutes on his back in this first round, didn't come close to working his way back up to his feet, didn't make much of an effort to get back up to his feet, and the only reason why he did get back up to his feet because Alves basically let him back up. Look, Alves just kind of stands back up and basically gives Dober the space to stand back up. So you can kind of see in that sequence that Dober is very weak off his back. We will just show just a little bit more footage. This is his fight against Brad Riddell. Of course, I don't want to show you footage of him against guys like Makhachev because that's just unfair with how good of a grappler Makhachev is. But we all know Brad Riddell is a striker, right? Brad Riddell's a striker. So you wouldn't expect Riddell to have a whole lot of success with his grappling. To be fair, he doesn't have tons of success with his grappling, but he does have a little bit of success. So when we consider how much of a better grappler Moicano is than Riddell, you can kind of start to imagine how much trouble Dober may find himself in against someone like Mr. Money Moicano himself. So anyway, Riddell shoots a desperation takedown here, tries to turn the corner and doesn't get it, stays persistent with it. Dober does a really good job of sprawling out of the takedown, clearing his legs out from underneath Mr. Riddell. But eventually, Riddell does manage to connect his hands around the single leg of Mr. Dober. And then transitions to a double leg and gets it. Now, Dober does a really good job of immediately scrambling back up to his feet. Shows a little bit more urgency than what he did against Alves. But it just shows that he can be taken down when you get in on a double leg. If we scroll through the fight a little bit deeper, you'll see more issues with Dober's grappling. And that's not a particularly big issue. Like that, I'm being harsh, right? Don't mean to say that is an issue because it's not. But if we keep going, you will start to see some issues. So here Dober's actually attempted a takedown, which has initiated a grappling exchange, which has then enabled Riddell to try and take him down. And now these are where these positions show far more issues with Dober's grappling. We can see Riddell moving for a back take here. Again, I'm just skipping through as I don't want this breakdown to be super long. But you can just see issues like in this position. The point I'm trying to make when I show you footage of positions like this is if you go and watch footage of Renato Moicano, he's got very fast, very slick back takes. So while Dober may be able to get away with hesitating in defending a position like this against someone like Brad Riddell, if he finds himself hesitating in positions like that against someone with the level of ground game that Renato Moicano has, you know, he's likely to get his back taken and dominated for the whole round. Maybe even, you know, submitted with a rear naked choke. But anyway, midway point of round 2. Nice takedown entry here, and we can see Dober practically leaps to the ground. Riddell does a good job of going to wrist control on Dober's right side. And this is where you can start to see issues creeping with Dober's ground game. He gave up a relatively cheap takedown there. And again, similar to the Alves fight, which looks very, very weak off his back here. Riddell didn't have the grappling control to keep him down though. Again, Dober does a good job of popping back up to his feet, but he does so in a risky way. He does so by giving his back up, completely exposing his back, which you can't see. My big fat head is in the way. But trust me, Dober's giving his back up, and if he were to again make that mistake against someone with very slick back takes like Moicano, he could find himself in a lot of trouble. We just go into this third round. Skip through, skip through. Skip through. Almost there, boys. Almost there. Almost there. So little positions like this. Again, desperation takedown. But if you start getting sucked into grappling exchanges against guys like Moicano, going to be in a lot of trouble. And you can just see at the end there, Riddell hits that reversal and puts Dober in a crucifix position. So again, you know, I don't want to be like super harsh on Dober, but I just want to show the little positions like that highlight that he makes mistakes, exposes his back, loses scrambles, gets reversed, gets his back taken, you know, things like that. To some extent you can get away with you know, someone like Riddell. When you're going up against a high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt with excellent grappling control like Moicano, you can't afford to make those mistakes. Now, I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to make this breakdown video really long by showing you footage of Moicano's offensive wrestling, grappling control, back takes, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Take it from me, it's really, really good. Moicano's MMA grappling is excellent. And if you want to, you know, do your own research just to kind of confirm what I've said, you know, go watch his fights against Jabe Herbert, Alexander Hernandez, Damir Hadzovic, and you'll see some pretty impressive, you know, Brad Riddell, you'll see some pretty impressive MMA grappling from Moicano. So this footage shows, or the footage I've just shown you highlights, Dober's takedown defense and ground game is very bad, and Moicano absolutely has the MMA grappling to make him pay for that. But earlier in the breakdown we said that this is a very difficult fight to bet because both guys have got major weaknesses that the other is in a very good position to exploit. And while there's big issues with Dober's takedown defense and ground game, there are equally big issues with Moicano's chin and durability, which is not a good thing when you're going up against a very dangerous striker in Drew Dober, who possesses true legit one-shot knockout power in every single limb on his body, has a lot of power in his hands. And the problem with Moicano is, you know, he's crazy, right? We all love Moicano. He's a wild guy. He's fun to watch. He's an amazing fighter. But he also loves to fight. He loves to scrap. He's a wild horse. He's a lunatic. He loves to throw down. The problem with Moicano is he loves to get into big exchanges and scrap. And unfortunately, he doesn't really have the chin to do it. If we take a look at his record, we can see that he has suffered, you know, a few pretty nasty knockout losses. Now, granted, these knockout losses were against some extremely high-level guys. You know, they were absolutely, you know, very, very dangerous strikers. However, Dober's also pretty fucking dangerous as well. And so, if Moicano does spend a prolonged period of this matchup standing and striking with Dober, which he does have a tendency to do, is pretty good chance Dober's going to clock him and ding him, knock him down, hurt him real bad on the feet. So this is one of those matchups where I do agree that Moicano is the favourite because his grappling enables him to dictate where the fight can take place. However, we know Dober's very dangerous, he's tough, he's got no quit in him, and he's got a good enough gas tank to remain dangerous enough to knock Moicano out for the full 3 rounds. It only takes one shot to land, Moicano's going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, what I can do, I guess, is kind of show you how fragile Moicano looks on the feet. I don't feel great about doing this, if I'm honest, because I'm really, really conscious that, like, when I cherry pick certain sequences, like certain short sequences from fights, it portrays fighters in perhaps a much more negative light than it is the reality. Like, I hate it when it you know, guys do it to me, right? I might lose one bet, and then people will like hold it against me for 10 years. You know, people will be like, oh, remember the time you bet, you know, such and such fighter and they got dominated, you're a fraud, you're a clueless idiot, blah, blah, blah. Like, they basically take you in your worst moment and they blow it up to be something huge, right? Without looking at the bigger picture, your full range of skills. And so I really don't like kind of clipping knockouts and stuff to try and make a fighter look bad. But what I would say about Moicano is, if you want to bet this fight, just go and watch some footage on him and just pay attention to how often his opponents land clean and hard, and he doesn't see the shots coming. Moicano's one of these guys that often reacts to shots after they land. So, for example, if someone lands a punch, then he'll move out the way. By then, it's too late. The shot's landed. This is a sign that their timing, their reflexes are a little bit off. And you know what they say? The shots that knock you out are the ones you don't see coming. And that's why Moicano does get dropped, knocked out, rocked, wobbled a lot. Because he just doesn't see shots coming. So I hate to cherry pick him in his worst moment here against Khizriev. But if you go watch all of his fights, you're just going to see that he does get dinged a lot. And one of the reasons he gets dinged a lot is because he loves to scrap. I love watching Moicano. He's an amazing fighter. But he just does, he loves to throw down, man. There's just no getting away from it. And I don't want to, again, make this breakdown super long. But the only way you're really going to see this is just by watching a few minutes of him standing and striking. Trying to think what other fights I could put on that highlight this. The Dos Anjos fight is the best one to illustrate it, but it's like 25 minutes long, man. So it's hard. You might not. This might not be that clear to you. You're just gonna have to kind of watch some footage of this guy for yourself, I think. It's basically Moicano's willingness to exchange is a big issue. He will go toe to toe with his opponents and loves to throw down. Another big issue with Moicano is that he doesn't like to take a backward step. He's got that old school shooto box style where he just continues to come forward, and when you land a big shot on him, he'll stand his ground and immediately look to fire back. That can get you into trouble against, well, guys like Khizriev, guys like Dober, who also like to stand their ground but can fire back with big devastating combos. That's basically what happens with Moicano here. Like I say, the Dos Anjos fight is the best fight to show you his issues with striking defense, but it's a long one and it would really extend the length of this breakdown video, so probably better off just doing your own research on that, watching the RDA Moicano fight itself, and you'll see what I mean. Also think I might have broken my finger, which isn't a good thing, it's fucking killing me, but swelling it pretty bad. This isn't the best fight to actually show the point I'm trying to make. So, again, you just have to kind of do your own research on it. Just have to kind of do your own research on it. Guess the point I'm trying to make with this fight is Dober's got a similar sort of body type to Khizriev. He's small, he's muscular, he's compact, he hits very hard. And this first round against Khizriev just shows Moicano's willingness to stand his ground in exchange, which I think is a big mistake. He was obviously outstriking Khizriev in that round, but he was also baiting Khizriev in the big exchanges. And while Moicano got the better of the majority of those exchanges, pretty much all those exchanges up until the point that he got knocked out, again to my point, it only takes one clean hard shot to land to knock you out. And so with someone like Moicano, who is such a good grappler but is a little chinny, I don't want to see him sucking Khizriev into big exchanges. I want to see him work way harder to get the fight to the ground, because if Moicano approaches the Dober fight in the same way, only shoots one takedown, perhaps doesn't get it, perhaps Dober stuffs it or quickly scrambles back up to his feet, you know, if Moicano is going to spend the majority of round one standing and striking instead of going to his grappling, I think there's a pretty good chance he could find himself getting knocked out before he gets an opportunity to go to his grappling. How often do we see that happen, where we've got a fighter that has a huge advantage over their opponent when it comes to grappling, but they just don't use it soon enough and wind up getting knocked out before they then get the opportunity. So it's a bit of a risk factor with Moicano, and because of that, it's a pretty tricky bet. pretty tricky fight to bet. I would pass on this one personally. Now, in terms of the over-under on this fight, I'd be very, very surprised if this fight went the distance. Very likely this one ends inside the distance because, again, the dynamic that makes this such a difficult fight to pick a winner in also makes this fight very likely to end inside the distance, because whenever you've got a dynamic where both fighters have huge advantages in the area that the other is weak, you know that at all times in the fight a finish is very likely to come. Because if the fight goes to the ground, we know Dober is in tons of trouble and Moicano's going to dominate him, possibly get a submission very quickly. But if the fight stays standing, we know Moicano's a bit shinny. We know Dober's got true legit knockout power. And so the whole time the fight is standing, a knockout is pretty likely as well. On top of that, Moicano's no punk on the feet either. Moicano's a great striker. Who knows, maybe he were to knock Dober out. So there's lots of ways that this fight could end inside the distance. And both these guys love to go to war as well. We've just seen Moicano doesn't like to take a backward step. Neither does Dober. They're both super aggressive. They're both absolute warriors. Money Moicano loves a bonus check as well, which means he's always going for the finish, always going for the kill, and taking risks in order to get the kill, which obviously sometimes backfires. So with that being said, very likely the fight ends inside the distance. Unfortunately, the odds are reflective of that, with being pretty steep favourites on the under. Now, in terms of the props, the two that I would take a look at, the odds on Dober to win by knockout or TKO are very bad. I would not bother with that. Moicano by submission, terrible odds. Wow, people are just assuming Moicano is going to get this to the ground and strangle Dober to death. Wouldn't be surprised, but those odds are very, very steep. If you really want to gamble on this fight, Moicano by decision. Maybe he uses a grappling heavy game plan, but Dober defends himself on the ground and Moicano can't get the submission. I mean, I'd be surprised. Moicano's submission game is very dangerous. I wouldn't bet a prop on this fight, but if you really want to gamble, Moicano by decision, I guess. But if I were you, I would pass on the props. The odds are pretty much bang on and exactly where they should be. So I hope you found that useful. Let me know in the comments below what you think. It's a great fight. It's a complex fight. I'm sure it's going to divide opinion, because fights where both guys have clear and obvious paths to victory quite often do divide opinion. I often think because people perhaps undervalue the extent at which the fighter they favour's weaknesses could potentially cost them. But what do I know? Just an idiot on the internet drinking energy drinks, talking bollocks about cage fighting. Okay. Next fight. Have a little bit of water as well. Okay. Next fight. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Now let's break down the fight between Randy Brown and Muslim Salikhov, a fight that was previously scheduled a while back. It's now been rescheduled. So Randy Brown, one of the biggest favourites on the card at average odds of around 1.36, which is going to be minus 278 for an implied probability of 74%. If we take a look at the odds on his opponent, Salikhov, he's around an average of 3.20, which is going to be plus 220 for an implied probability of 31%. So Brown, 33 years old, 6'3" with a 78-inch reach. Salikhov, 39 years old, 5'11" with a 70-inch reach. So we've got two pretty major X factors on this one. The first being the size. We can see that Randy Brown has an enormous 8-inch reach advantage over Salikhov, which statistically gives him around a 7% chance, 70% chance of winning, 7-0. And we've had a really good recent example of how much of an advantage having a big reach is over your opponent. Well, obviously, in the last event, when we broke down the fight between Charles Jourdain and Sean Woodson, we were talking about how Jourdain might find it difficult to get inside the length, the reach, the size of Woodson. And of course he did. He really, really struggled with Woodson's size advantage and length and reach. So even though Salikhov's a very high-level striker, it isn't going to be easy for him to get inside that 8-inch reach, get inside a longer, taller opponent like Randy Brown. So that reach is a bit of a nightmare. On top of that, Brown really knows how to use it. Brown does a great job of using his length and reach and fighting long, which means, you know, that 8-inch reach advantage is extenuated, because, you know, you could give an 8-inch reach advantage to a fighter and they're always going to have an advantage, but when they really know how to use it, that's when it becomes a huge weapon, and Randy Brown definitely knows how to use it. The second X factor is the age gap between these two. So we can see that there is a 6-year age gap in this fight, but remember what we said in the breakdown for Dolidze versus Imavov, where we said that statistics are only useful when interpreted correctly. And even though based on age Imavov had close to a 70% chance of beating Dolidze, for me the statistic doesn't really mean anything in the context of the Dolidze Imavov fight, because Dolidze is still improving. He's not at that stage in his career where he's declining and therefore is at a disadvantage going up against a young, hungry bull. So even though there was an 8-year age gap in that fight, it doesn't really mean anything. There's a smaller age gap in this matchup. There's only a 6-year age gap between Salikhov and Brown. But this is one of those matchups where the stats can become very, very useful. Because at 33 years old, Randy Brown is in his absolute prime for a welterweight, and should even maybe be getting a little bit better from fight to fight. Whereas Salikhov at 39 years old, he's going to be 40 years old in a few months. He is on a steep decline, and we've seen him decline in his fights. He's nowhere near as sharp as he used to be. Of course, he fell apart, completely imploded in his last fight against Nicholas Dalby. So Salikhov is a fighter that's on a steep decline. Brown's in his prime. So even though with the 6-year age gap, Brown has like a 66% chance of winning statistically, again, just like his reach and the ability to use it, I think that age statistic is extenuated and far more meaningful in a matchup like this, where you've got a guy like Salikhov on a steep decline and a guy like Brown who's in his prime. You know, that 6-year age gap on a fight like this is far more meaningful than a 6-year age gap when you've got, you know, a 36-year-old fighting or a 35-year-old fighting a 29-year-old, for example. As a 35-year-old won't be declining at the same level of Salikhov, or he might be, but it's unlikely. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, at this stage in their careers, this is a matchup where I do feel Randy Brown is significantly better than Muslim Salikhov everywhere. Obviously, they're primarily strikers, so you'd expect the majority of this fight to stay on the feet. But if it were go to the ground, I still give Brown the advantage there. You know, Brown's takedown offense isn't the best. He is quite weak off his back. But Salikhov's takedown offense and ground game is quite bad as well. Even if Salikhov were to have success with his grappling in this fight, by getting on top of Brown or maybe putting him in a bad position, Salikhov's one of these guys that gasses very, very quickly when he grapples. So even if he were to have some success in the fight with grappling, it would likely come at the cost of him gassing out. Whereas Randy Brown has got the cardio he needs to go hard for 3 rounds, no problem. He's got great cardio, so it won't matter to him. Even if he finds himself in a bad position on the ground, he'll probably benefit from it with Salikhov tiring out. So Brown's definitely got the advantage on the ground. His size obviously will also, you know, make life difficult for Salikhov on the ground, because Brown's got that leverage with those long old limbs that he can use the big brother Salikhov in grappling positions. He's also got a tricky submission game, very flexible, and dangerous arm bars and submissions with those long legs that you can, you know, generate a lot of leverage from. Now in terms of striking, we know Randy Brown uses length well. He's got great footwork, great movement, and one of Brown's biggest strengths are his amazing leg kicks. He's got a really good leg kicking game. Striking defense is also very good. It's not easy to get to Brown. A lot of guys that are abnormally long and tall are a little bit slow, a little bit clunky, you know, not the best defensively, but Brown's a bit of an outlier in that sense, in that defensively he's very, very good, very sharp, very fast, very technical. He sees everything coming. Now, Salikhov's a flashy striker, lots of spinning shit. He does have big power in his hands, so it's possible that he could catch Brown with a big shot and knock him out. But the age gap the size, the reach, how technical Brown is. Personally, I think you're just going to see Brown, kind of dance around Salikhov and pick him apart. I think the early stages of this fight will be competitive because Salikhov is still skilled enough to give Brown problems early. But as soon as Salikhov starts to slow around that midway point in the fight, that's when Brown can really start to pull away from him and put major volume on him. So it's a really good stylistic matchup for Brown, and I'd expect him to win pretty comfortably. Unfortunately, he's a big favourite, which means it's tricky to bet on him in this matchup because Salikhov's dangerous enough to not want to take Brown at huge favourite odds. Having said that, if you are a statistics-based bettor, Brown does have two huge statistical trends in his favour. Based on that, it's debatable whether there is still value on him, because if you look at the implied probability on his odds, 1.36, that gives him an implied probability of 74%. Now, if we know based on his reach, he's got like a 67% chance of winning, his age, like a 66-67% chance of winning. That doesn't quite hit his implied probability of 74%, but when you combine those two strong trends together and throw into the mix the fact that Salikhov's cardio is quite bad, and you throw into the mix the fact that, Brown can go hard for 3 rounds and he's the more technical, skilled striker at this stage in his career, and he's pretty good defensively, there is a case for justifying a bet on Brown in this odds range, but obviously you're paying a steep price. Let me know what you think though. Let me know in Discord what you think. Let me know in the comments below. If you're a stats-based bettor, do you like the trends that Brown's got on his side enough to pull the trigger on him as a relatively big favourite? I'd be keen to know what you think. In terms of the over-under on this one, the bookies are quite torn. They've got the over-under pretty much in the even money odds range on fight to go to a decision or not to go to a decision. I do get that. I'm very torn as well. I don't have a strong opinion on whether this fight will go the distance or not. The reason why I don't have a strong opinion is because both guys are capable of getting finishes, in the sense that Salikhov hits very hard, and we have seen Brown get knocked out and dinged in the past. I could see Salikhov landing a bomb and knocking Brown out. I could also see Salikhov showing up and having declined even more than we've seen him in recent fights, and Brown just putting it on him, being too much for him, lighting him up and basically getting him out of there when Salikhov's too tired and too beat up to kind of defend himself. I could see that happening. On the flip side, I could see a situation where Randy Brown very much respects Salikhov's power and implements a similar game plan to what he used against Chaos Williams, where he made a conscious decision not to get into any big exchanges and instead stayed on the outside, played the role of Matador, and chipped away at Chaos Williams from a safe distance without trying to put himself in too much danger. If he were to use that game plan against Salikhov, I think there's a very good chance the fight will go to a decision, because Salikhov is tough, but he doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes, and he's not particularly aggressive. So if Brown is happy to stay on the outside and kind of chip away at Salikhov with leg kicks and jabs, doesn't get into any big exchanges, doesn't force the action, could see a situation where we see a bit of a point fighting contest. Brown just outworks Salikhov and outpoints Salikhov to a comfortable decision without putting himself in too much danger, and in that sense I could see the fight very much go into a decision. So I'm very, very torn on the over-under. I think it could go either way, and for that reason I can't bet it. Now, in terms of the prop bets on this one, the only one I would go for is Brown by decision, but the odds are absolutely terrible, so I would give that a miss. But I do think that's the most likely prop to hit. Hope you found it useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is Natalia Silva versus Viviane Araujo. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Silva is a pretty big favourite at average odds of around 1.28, which is minus 357 for an implied probability of 78%. If we take a look at the odds on Viviane Araujo, she is around an average of 3.75, which is going to be plus 275 for an implied probability of 27%. So Natalia Silva was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet on this card, because from memory this was a really bad stylistic matchup for Viviane Araujo, and I thought this may have been an opportunity for us to snipe another one of those low hanging fruit, low risk bets where even though we have to bet on a big favourite, we can kind of justify doing it because there's virtually no risk factors. And of course we won a nice bet on Jasmine Jasudavicius on the last event because we identified that it was extremely unlikely Priscilla Cachoeira would cause Jasmine any kind of problems, and that's exactly what happened, right? Jasmine dominated, won the fight very comfortably. Now, as you guys know, I don't bet big favourites in MMA very often, but if I am going to bet big favourites, it tends to be in women's MMA where the chances of a flash KO are far less likely. And if we look at the last two big favourites I've bet, they've been similar kind of bets, right? We bet on Jasmine Jasudavicius as a big favourite to beat Priscilla Cachoeira, and also Miranda Maverick as a big favourite to beat Priscilla Cachoeira. I thought Natalia Silva might be another relatively risk-free bet that we could take, but even though I still heavily lean towards her, and I'm guessing a lot of other people do because her odds have declined quite a bit over the last week, I don't like Silva enough to bet her as a big favourite, and I will explain why. So Silva's 26 years old, 5'4" with a 65-inch reach. Viviane Araujo, 37 years old, 5'4" with a 68-inch reach. So there are a couple of interesting X factors on this one. We can see that Araujo has a 3-inch reach advantage over Silva, which isn't a massive reach advantage, but obviously these girls are fighting in the flyweight division and they're both 5'4". So in most divisions a 3-inch reach advantage isn't going to be a particularly big deal, but in the flyweight division where 3 inches is a greater overall percentage of a fighter's wingspan, you know, a 3-inch reach advantage in the flyweight division is probably more like a 5 or 6 reach advantage in the middleweight or light heavyweight division, because we're dealing with wingspan percentages, right? So that is a decent reach advantage for Araujo, to be fair. Now, when we look at the age between these two, or the age of these two, we can see there's a massive age difference. Araujo is 11 years older than Silva, which statistically gives Silva around a 70% chance of winning 7-0. You know, it's a big trend on Silva's side. However, like I always say, statistics are only useful when interpreted correctly, and we do have to use nuance. I think stats are very useful when used in confluence with fight research to basically confirm or add more weight or more conviction to perspectives that we hold around the matchup, but you can't blindly follow stats in a sport as complex as MMA. And in the case of Viviane Araujo, she is an interesting one because at 37 years old, she is very old for a flyweight. We know that fighters in the lighter weight classes tend to decline earlier in their careers, because the lighter weight classes are all about speed, reflexes and athleticism. But Araujo is a bit of a unicorn because at 37 years old, she's getting better. And she's making quite big improvements from fight to fight. If we look at her record, it's a little bit mixed, right? Some wins, some losses. She's not really doing a particularly good job of building momentum. But she has been in the UFC for a long time, 5 years now, dating back to 2019. And I'd actually say that her two relatively recent performances against Alexa Grasso and Jennifer Maia were her two best performances of her career. So this is an interesting matchup because I don't feel Araujo is one of those aging, declining fighters going up against a young, hungry bull. I actually think this is one of those situations where putting a lot of weight on the age statistic in a matchup such as this could get you into trouble. Because for me, Araujo is like a seasoned veteran that's very well-rounded and very experienced. And Silva's very green and inexperienced. this is like a giant leap in competition for Silva. Like, if you look at her record, she's fought, with the exception of Jasmine Jasudavicius, she's fought a very low level of opponent, in my opinion. Blader, Leonardo, and Lee. I love watching Andrea Lee. She's a great fighter, but she also has a lot of weaknesses that can be exploited. Or a lot of weaknesses that a fighter like Silva was well positioned to exploit. And styles make fights. So even though Jasudavicius is very good, whereas Silva was well positioned to exploit Andrea Lee's weaknesses because of how they matched up skill for skill, Silva was also well positioned to exploit Jasudavicius' weaknesses, but she may not be as well positioned to exploit Araujo's weaknesses, because in terms of styles, Araujo and Jasudavicius and Araujo and Andrea Lee, very different fighters. So this is an interesting matchup. Now, both of them are primarily strikers, and I'd expect this fight to stay on the feet. The reason being, Silva never tries to take her opponents down. I don't recall ever seeing Silva shoot a takedown. And while Araujo's offensive wrestling is good, and she will shoot takedowns, what we saw from Natalia Silva in her fights against Teresa Blader and also Jasudavicius is that her takedown offense is top tier. She's extremely difficult to take down, extremely difficult to hold down. So I don't expect Araujo to have much success with her grappling in this fight. It's probably going to be a stand-up fight. Now, if it stays standing, this is a real interesting matchup because Silva has looked incredible on the feet against the level of opponents she's been facing. She hits hard, she's technical, she fights at a high pace, she looks the total package. However, we need to remind ourselves that she has been facing Andrea Lee, who is very bad defensively, Victoria Leonardo, who's very bad defensively and has no power in her hands, very, very low level striker, Teresa Blader, who has zero striking, she's a pure grappler, literally nothing on the standing on the feet at all, and also Jasudavicius, pretty low level striker, pretty bad defensively, no power in her hands. So while Silva's looked incredible against her last 4 opponents, she is absolutely styled on them. Araujo is several levels above those 4 opponents that we've seen Silva go up against. And while Silva looks incredible on the feet, very technical, moves very well, we haven't really seen her face any adversity or put in any bad positions. We haven't seen her get punched very hard in the face or pressured or face someone who is reasonably good at defending themselves, which, to be fair, Araujo is. Araujo has one of these styles where she uses a lot of footwork and movement, and she likes to either be all the way outside of a range where she can be hit or all the way on the inside blitzing forward. So she does have an awkward style of striking on the feet, which we haven't really seen Silva deal with. So this is one of those matchups where I definitely favour Silva, and I think she will win. I really like Silva. Based on her past performances, I have a feeling she is potential future champion, and at present skilled enough to be a top 5 fighter. But this is her first true test, and I am not interested in betting on her as a big favourite when facing such a big step up in competition for the first time. And like I say, she was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet, so I researched her last week when she was up in this odds range. Just wouldn't feel confident or comfortable betting her in as a big favourite. I want to see how she does in this fight against Araujo. It's a great matchup because Araujo's no picnic for anyone. One thing you can say about Araujo is very, very rare you'll see her get dominated. She's at that level where she is reasonably skilled at everything. Therefore, no one's ever going to have it easy against her it's always going to be a competitive fight. I know Rebus did pretty well against her, but there were some flash knockdowns and shit. Outside of that, she always makes a fight of it. It's always competitive. So it's a real good matchup, man. It's a real good matchup. But because I like Silva so much, I wouldn't bet Araujo as a big underdog. Okay, alright. Over-unders on this one. Both girls tough as nails. Both girls well-rounded. Not easy to finish either of them. Very likely this goes the distance. You can see that Silva frequently goes deep in fights. Araujo's a decisionator. Her last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 fights have gone to a decision. Very likely this one goes to a decision as well. The odds reflect that with it being in big favourite odds. But again, you know, implied probability of 70%. 71%. 9 of Araujo's last... Well, all 9 of Araujo's last fights have gone the distance. The 2 before that almost did. So, is there value on the over at 1.540 minus 250? Let me know what you think. Let me know. Would you bet that? Very likely to go to a decision. I know that much. Steep price to pay, but, you know... These girls are very likely to go to a decision, so let me know what you think. In terms of the props, the only one that I would consider would be Silva by decision. For me, the odds aren't great. Very steep favourite odds to bet on such a specific outcome in a cage fight to the death. But I do think that's the most likely outcome, but I won't be betting it myself. So I hope you found that useful. Now, let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Salikhov Khizriev. And I apologise to everyone watching this because you're all probably cringing at that pronunciation. I know I butchered the pronunciation of Khizriev's name, but you guys know who I'm talking about, and he's fighting Mr. Muradov. Hopefully I got that one correct. So if we take a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Khizriev is the favourite at average odds of around 1.67, which is going to be minus 149 for an implied probability of 60%. We take a look at the odds on Mr. Muradov, he's around an average of, say, 2.25, which is going to be plus 125 for an implied probability of 44%. So Khizriev is 33 years old, 5'9", with a 74-inch reach, and Muradov is 33 years old, 6'2", with a 75.5-inch reach. So both guys the same age, but there is a pretty big difference in size here. So even though they've both got a very similar reach, Khizriev is very, very small for the division at only 5'9", while Muradov is a very big middleweight at 6'2". He's on the bigger end of the scale for middleweights. So here you've got a situation where Khizriev has the technical ability and skills to cause Muradov big problems with his offensive wrestling, his combat sambo background. But the size difference between these two could complicate things and make Khizriev's life very difficult. Let me explain. So, in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, we don't know a whole lot about Khizriev's striking because the majority of his fights over the last few years have ended very quickly, as you can see, all these quick finishes. And the ones that went the distance were either against a low level of opponent, or a very long time ago, this one as you can see was 7 years ago, or involved a lot of grappling. So I don't really have a particularly good read on Khizriev's striking because I haven't seen very much of it. But obviously we know a lot about Muradov's striking, and we know he's got a really good jab, he's got good footwork, good movement, throws a high volume of strikes, decent power to be fair, not devastating power but decent power, and he's a very, very dangerous striker. I don't know anything about Khizriev's striking really due to a lack of footage, but I would imagine that with the size difference between these two and how well Muradov moves, I'd imagine Muradov has a big advantage when it comes to striking. Just because, again, we'll use the example of Sean Woodson versus Charles Jourdain on the last card. It's not going to be easy for someone that is 5'9" to get inside and land on someone like Muradov that is so much bigger but also knows how to fight long and use his size. His footwork, his movement is great. It's really, really good. So it's a little bit inconclusive, but I would imagine Muradov has a big advantage on the feet. Now when it comes to grappling, Khizriev has a huge advantage on the ground. he's a good offensive wrestler with good grappling control. And while Muradov's takedown defense isn't terrible, Muradov is one of these guys that if you do chain wrestle a little bit and work to get into the ground, he's quite weak off his back and he's quite easy to hold down and control. Now, there are pros to Khizriev's body type in a matchup like this, and there's also cons. The pro is that with him being a lot smaller than Muradov at 5'9", when he shoots takedowns, he's going to have that lower center of gravity, which means it'll be easier for him to shoot in on the legs and hips of Muradov. And obviously we know the deeper you get in, the lower you get in on the legs and hips of your opponent, the higher the probability is you're going to complete the takedown. So with Khizriev being smaller and more compact, Muradov being longer, lankier and taller, that will help Khizriev hit takedowns in this matchup. So that is the benefit of him being 5'9". The downside, the con to him being 5'9", is that this is a situation where he's just fighting a much larger human being. You know, by the time they rehydrate after the weigh-ins, Muradov is going to be a big, strong, athletic, muscular dude who has a very similar wingspan to light heavyweights. Does actually have a wingspan that you'd see in the light heavyweight division, whereas Khizriev has a wingspan that you would see in the lightweight division. You know, I think Dustin Poirier has got a very similar wingspan to this. I think Poirier's like 5'9", maybe 71, 72 inch reach. So Khizriev is undersized here and fighting a much larger human being. And so ultimately we've got weight classes for a reason. And even though Muradov's takedown offense isn't great, and Khizriev, based on past performances, likely has the offensive wrestling to take Muradov down and control him, size can be a great equalizer, and it might be very difficult for someone that is only 5'9" to take down and hold down a much larger opponent who is 6'2". So when we look at this matchup from a stylistic point of view, it is a very bad stylistic matchup for Muradov because his takedown offense isn't great. He's very weak off his back and he's facing a strong grappler. However, the size difference could make this one very interesting, especially if Muradov shows a little bit more urgency to work his way back up to his feet. So this is one of those matchups where I do lean towards Khizriev for sure, because his grappling, similar to Moicano, gives him the ability to dictate where the fight should take place. But with Khizriev being relatively inexperienced in his UFC career and being very undersized, I would not be surprised at all if Muradov found this interesting. I also will just quickly mention something that I'm going to be talking about a lot in breakdowns over the next sort of year, in that, for me, skill for skill, from a technical point of view, I think Muradov is one of the best middleweights in the world. I think the only thing that's held him back in his UFC career has been his gas tank. There have been fights where he's slowed down a lot in the second half of fights and has then not been able to perform to his full potential. He's been too tired. But if Muradov had cardio to go hard for 3 rounds, I think he would be a top 5 middleweight. I think he's very, very, very good. Now, obviously towards the end of last year, the UFC broke their relationship with USADA, and Hunter Campbell, who is like literally reminds me of some fucking villain out of some movie, did a press conference with Jeff Nowitzki, and he was like, guys, don't panic. You know what I mean? We still have the highest level of integrity in the history of the world when it comes to sports. We will still have the best drug testing. Nowitzki is so passionate about, you know, making this a clean sport. Blah, 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 blah. We just think we can do better than USADA. Cool. Sure you do. You know, it's not like you're owned by the same company as the WWE or anything like that, where, you know, all the WWE athletes are clearly completely natural and none of them are taking any performance enhancing drugs. You know, it's definitely not a red flag that you're now using the same drug testing company as the WWE. There's definitely nothing to see here. Everything's above board. The UFC literally has the highest level of integrity in the whole of sports, and I'm sure the fact that USADA have been told to kick rocks has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that you want to make it easier for your fighters and athletes to take performance enhancing drugs to basically give us more entertaining fights. Because let's be real, the UFC was a lot more fun to watch before USADA turned up. I'm massively in favour of it being the Wild Wild West and fighters being able to take wherever the fuck they want to take, and for USADA to not be in the sport. Because from a purely selfish point of view, if you go and watch UFC fights pre-2015 when USADA was introduced, or you go back and watch old Strikeforce cards, or you go watch the old Pride events, they're absolutely fucking brilliant. And the sport was way more entertaining back then. Sorry to sound like a grumpy old dinosaur, but it's just true. So I'm fully in favour of USADA being shown the door. I think it's a great thing, and I think it could potentially make the UFC way better, way more entertaining, way more fun to watch. Sport was way better when USADA wasn't around. Why am I even bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because now that USADA have been told to kick rocks, we have seen a few performances from a few fighters which are very much out of character with past performances. I won't bring up Dricus du Plessis simply because I bet that fight, so I don't want it to make it sound like I'm bitter or making excuses. But we can certainly bring up Mr. Andre Muniz, you know, guys like Andre Muniz as an example in his fight against Jun Young Park, who had significantly better cardio compared to his past fights. And there have been other examples in recent matchups where, you know, a lot of fighters that you would expect to kind of slow down and not perform particularly well in the second half of matchups have actually gone on to look way better than they ever have done before. And so for that reason, I would keep my eye on a guy like Muradov, because in my opinion he's one of the best middleweights in the world, and if he just had better cardio, for me he could be a legit title contender. And so without USADA in the picture, if this guy gets on the juicy juice, starts taking some special supplements, you know, sees a doctor who helps him do a little bit of magic here and there, this guy could very quickly look exponentially better than he has in the past. And it'll be interesting to see how he looks this weekend, because when you go back to 2015, we saw some of the best fighters in the world see their careers fall off an absolute cliff. We saw guys like Johnny Hendricks and Luke Rockhold in the discussion for being the greatest pound-for-pound fighters in the world. The 12 months later, you know, literally being called bums and seeing their career fall apart. You know, we saw guys like Anthony Pettis go from running up the side of cages and doing spinning back kicks like something out of a movie to looking very flat and very slow in a very short space of time. You know, look at the changes in Vitor Belfort's body and physique, right? So back in 2015, we saw massive changes to fighters where they declined when USADA came in. So I think now that USADA's gone, we're going to see the opposite, where there will be fighters that make exponential improvements, and you've got to look towards guys like Muradov to fit the profile of someone that could potentially be a real top contender in this division, because PEDs will help him improve his cardio if he were to choose to use them. So that's a bit of a tangent, but something definitely worth thinking about over the next sort of 6 months to a year, as you start to see fighters perhaps experience the benefits of doing a training camp or two with some extra supplements to help them along the way. Because when USADA were first introduced, it's not like you suddenly saw Johnny Hendricks' career fall off a cliff. It took 6 to 12 months for the benefits of using performance enhancing drugs to kind of seep out of his system, I guess, or for him to lose that muscle mass and that athleticism. It took time, it was a process, but after 6 to 12 months you really saw what was up with guys like Rockhold, Pettis, Hendricks, Belfort, yada yada yada. The list is endless. The sport was flipped on its head. Keep an eye on guys like Muradov. So let's take a look at the props on the over-under on this one. So, in terms of the over-under, do think there's a pretty good chance this fight goes over 1.5 rounds. And for that reason, I'm very tempted to bet it. Now, there's a potential that Muradov's size could really cause Khizriev huge problems and maybe gets knocked out or just big brothered on the ground. But I think that because Muradov's not a massive power puncher, Khizriev's a tough Russian, and because Muradov is tough and will fight hard to defend himself on the ground, reasonably likely the over 1.5 rounds hits. If we look at their records, we can see that Muradov frequently does fight for more than a round and a half. You can see here round decision, round 3. This one would have just fallen short of the over 1.5 rounds, but then these two would have go into a decision. If you look at Khizriev's record, he does have a lot of finishes on his record, but obviously he's facing a higher level of opponent now in Muradov, and so it's not going to be as easy for him to get Muradov out of there as some of his past opponents. Now, in terms of the props on this one, Khizriev by decision I think is the most likely outcome, but again the odds aren't great, so you might want to take a chill on that and pass if I were you. So I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below or on Discord. How do you feel USADA going is going to influence the sport? Let me know what you think. Anyway, now let's break down the final fight on this main card, which is going to be Charles Radtke versus Gilbert Urbina. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Urbina is the favourite at average odds of around 1.50, which is minus 200 for an implied probability of 67%. If we take a look at the odds on Radtke, he's around an average of 2.65, which is going to be plus 165 for an implied probability of 38%. So Urbina is 27 years old, 6'3", with a 75-inch reach, and Radtke is 33 years old, 5'9", with a 72-inch reach. So we can see 6-year age gap in this fight, but Radtke pretty young in his career and not particularly old for a welterweight, so I wouldn't expect age to play a factor in this matchup. Size could though, because there is a big size difference in this matchup. Looking forward to seeing the tail of the tape, or not the tail of the tape, the stay-ins at the weigh down. Can't get my words out. Looking forward to seeing the stare downs at the weigh-ins for this one, because this could be one of those matchups where the size difference is enormous. I mean, you can even see it when you watch their past fights. Radtke is like a smaller, more muscular, compact guy, and Urbina looks absolutely huge. He's really long and tall. So 6'3", with a 75-inch reach versus 5'9" with a 72-inch reach does give Urbina an advantage, because he's just going to be the bigger, more physically imposing man in there. So, in terms of how these two match up stylistically, they both like to grapple, and they are both primarily grapplers. So I would expect to see a decent amount of grappling in this fight. If it stays standing, just because of the size and length of Urbina and the fact that Radtke is like a tough, scrappy kind of brawler, I think Urbina is likely to do pretty well on the feet, because Radtke's not a particularly dangerous striker, and Urbina should be able to use his size and length to just pick Radtke off, outstrike him from a safe distance. Now, in terms of grappling, this is one of those matchups where we spoke a little bit about how both Roman Dolidze and Nasruddin Imavov are quite unique grapplers, in the sense that they're both pretty good when they're the aggressor, pretty good at offensive grappling, but they're both pretty bad defense, and that's quite rare, to be fair. You usually see a level of grappling offense from someone very similar to their level of grappling defense. We've got another couple of unicorns here in Urbina and Radtke, where again, offensively, both of their grappling is reasonably good. They're both reasonably good offensive grapplers, reasonably heavy top game, reasonably good grappling control. I mean, Urbina's grappling control is a lot better than Radtke's, probably due to his size. Perhaps Radtke's a little bit undersized to control guys on the ground, but generally speaking, offensively, they're both pretty good. Defensively, they're both pretty bad. Both of them have bad takedown defense. They're both very weak on the ground, very weak off their back. So, in terms of how these two match up from a betting point of view, my lean's definitely Urbina, just because his size and his reach will give him the advantage in all areas that this fight takes place. If it stays standing, it's going to be difficult for Radtke to get inside and land, and Urbina should be able to use his size to overwhelm and big brother Radtke on the ground. Ultimately, if you've got a guy that's 6'3" and a guy that's 5'9", and they're both quite weak off their back, the smaller fighter is in a lot more trouble, because it's going to be far easier for the larger fighter, the bigger man, to use his physicality on the ground to overwhelm the smaller guy and keep him in bad positions for longer. So that's why my lean on this one is Urbina, but because he is quite bad defensively, too big of a favourite for me to bet, so it's an easy pass. In terms of the over-under, it's pretty likely this one will go over actually, and the over 1.5 rounds is very tempting for me. The reason why it's very tempting is because neither of these guys are particularly dangerous. So even though when you look at their records, Urbina as an example, seen loads of his fights end inside the distance, he isn't particularly dangerous. When you look at Radtke's record, again, a lot of his fights have ended inside the distance, but he isn't particularly dangerous. So when you get two guys that are not particularly dangerous and they're both reasonably tough, there's a good chance the fight goes deeper. And so I do think there's a good chance this fight lasts longer than 1.5 rounds, and I'll probably be betting that myself. So I hope you found that useful. Do we have any... Oh, sorry, I forgot about the old props on this one. Have I lost the fight? I have lost the fight. Where's it gone? Here we go. Let's take a quick look at the props. So the prop I would go for would be Urbina by decision, but I don't love the odds. If you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on it to make watching the fight more interesting, go for it, but I don't think it's a particularly good bet. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Thank you very much for watching. Please hit the like button if you haven't already. Subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Why would you not be a subscriber? How could you do that to me? How could you watch my videos without subscribing? Who would do such a thing? But have a great weekend. Hope you make loads of money. I hope you crush it. I hope you found this video useful. I hope it helps you in some way. Have a great week, guys. Love you all very much. I'll see you back here for the next video next week. Nice one, guys. Take care. Bye.